Hello, I'm Mark.
Hi, I'm Brian, and welcome to the Therapy Shed podcast. Hello,
Hello, Brian.
episode 5.
Episode 5.
Yeah. How's your week been?
I'm just having a drink of water there. Yeah, it's been good. It's been okay, thanks. What have I been doing this week? I feel like I'm in that mindset at the moment quite often where when someone says, how you doing? You just go, yeah, I'm okay. And they say, what have you been doing? And you say, I don't really know. I've just been, the days have just fallen one into the other. Yeah, I'm doing okay. I've been obviously working with clients and just kind of work and doing a bit of exercise into the summertime now. So I feel like it's been quite humid. I do enjoy the sunshine. I'm a sunshine person, but I think the weather's going up and down like Tower Bridge at the moment, you know, from one extreme to the other. But yeah, I'm doing. You're sorry you asked now, aren't you? Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm looking forward to recording another episode of the Therapy Shed, the podcast.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Similar to yourself, really, and I think a lot of people are similar. I think, obviously, we're still in this situation with lockdown, but everybody sort of, I feel like everybody's sort of similar to yourself, where people are saying, yeah, I'm okay, but then not really aware of how they're actually feeling because we're stuck in this sort of uncertainty at the moment, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very prominent at the moment, isn't it, Brian? And I feel I've sounds like I've had similar experiences to you with speaking to a lot of people, personally, of course, clients as well, professionally, people in work, people in different areas of my life, and I think there's definitely a sense of growing frustration, shall we say, fed up. People just feel a little bit, understandably, you know, tired and exhausted maybe with the pandemic, I guess, and the restrictions and the uncertainty, the inevitable anxiety that comes with it. And I think it probably feels like it's been going on so long now that it's, I think we're all dreaming of the end, and yet I think you said to me recently it feels like the goalposts keep getting shifted, and I think that's definitely a common understanding at the moment with a lot of people I'm talking to.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of clients I've seen recently, and not just clients, friends, just people I've spoke to. There just seems to be a lot of frustration around, just it's everything, isn't it? It's sort of not being able to go on holiday, not being able to go to weddings, not being able to just feel relaxed if they're going out.
That's it. I think relaxed when you just living your everyday life, socialising with people, what you can do, what people are comfortable with, is a huge part of, hopefully coming towards the end of the pandemic as we've known it for the last, over a year now. Hopefully coming towards the end of that, but also obviously into I'm hesitant to say like a post-pandemic society, but I think you know what I mean, don't you? Like, what's the next stage? Hopefully, once we start coming out of a pandemic, what people are comfortable with, and how it's affected different people in different ways, and of course, what the actual rules are as well, legally speaking, shall we say? What's the official line on what we can do and what we can't do? All that I think is weighing on the shoulders at the moment.
Definitely, 100%. And this is why, we thought it would be a good idea to do an episode on anger, because there seems to be a lot of frustration and anger around at the moment. But just before we get into that, I just wanted to say, touching on sort of how's our week been, one really good thing that has made me feel really positive and really good is the amount of feedback we've had from the podcasts.
Definitely, yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to say that as well. It's been so uplifting for us. I completely agree for myself as well. It's been so lovely to hear the sincere feedback. You know, it doesn't necessarily always have to be kind and you know, complimentary as such. It's just really sincere. It's nice to hear what different people are getting out of listening to the early episodes. Suggestions as well. You know, feedback is obviously helpful for us to shape future episodes. Part of the reason why why we're going to have a chat about anger today is people giving us their feedback and what they like us to explore.
Yeah, definitely. But, feedback, we've asked for positive and sort of negative, just that sort of feedback of what we can do better, what we can do different, ideas of different episodes or what people would like us to talk about. Because I think when we first sort of said about giving feedback, the first thing that comes to my mind is when you ask your family. It's a bit like going on X Factor.
Yeah.
And you're an absolute rubbish singer, but your mum says, "Oh no, that's really good." So then you go on X Factor in front of thousands of people, and
well, that could be us. We don't know yet. We've only had a few episodes out. We might not be in the televised rounds yet, but yeah, definitely. Yeah. Sorry.
So I was going to say, I mean, the whole reason we set the podcast up, or the idea of the podcast, was we thought it would be a good idea for us to record some of the conversations that we have around sort of our ideas around therapy and the different sort of aspects of mental wellness and things like that. And it's just a bonus if people listen to us and hopefully take something from it, whether that just be something for them to think about and reflect on, or lead them to accessing therapy themselves. Because I think everybody should have a go with therapy, just to help them learn a bit more about themselves or their experiences. I don't think there's any harm in that. So I think if people listen to us and they decide to go and seek out therapy, counselling, coaching, then I think that's a positive thing, definitely.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you say, and just hopefully, we discussed this a little bit on one of the earlier episodes, didn't we? Earlier podcasts. It was understanding ourselves a little bit better is always a good thing, actually, and having maybe the confidence or feeling safe enough to do that. Whether you're doing that on your own personal self-reflections, and hopefully a podcast like this can help with that, or of course therapy sessions can be a great environment for facilitating that. Just learning about the mind, and of course your mind specifically as well, it's always a good thing.
It's just getting that objective view, isn't it, of somebody else that's not emotionally invested in you. I think we can always learn something about ourselves.
Definitely, yeah. And just coming back before we come on to today's topic of anger, just coming back to what you said about the feedback we've had from the early episodes so far. If people do want to contact us, let us know, their thoughts or what they've taken or what they'd like to hear more of or less of in future podcasts, future episodes. Please do contact us. Definitely let us know. We will we will shape future episodes based on feedback. So you can contact us at the on the gram, on Instagram, Therapy Shed Podcast on Instagram, or of course the Therapy Shed Podcast at gmail.com.
Yeah, that'd be good. And even ideas of guests or people that you'd like us to try and get on. We've got quite a few lines up already, which I'm really looking forward to. But people might have suggestions of things that we've not thought about, or an idea.
Yeah, or topics that they like to hear us explore, or me and you just shoot the breeze about.
Yeah,
definitely. Please get in touch. Let us know. So, anger. We're going to have a chat about anger today.
Mm-hmm.
This episode is called Looking Back in Anger. Looking back at anger.
Looking back at anger. I think the starting point with most of the things that we talk about, really, emotion-wise, we spoke about anxiety on the previous podcast, and today we're talking about anger, is for me it's really important for people to understand that, again, anger is just a normal human emotion. We all experience it. It can be a healthy emotion. It can be an emotion that keeps us safe, ultimately. So I think just as a sort of, well, not, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think, but certainly just for people to hold in their minds that anger is not a bad thing necessarily. The time where anger becomes bad is when it becomes unhealthy, when it starts having a negative impact on you or the people around you.
Definitely, I think that's a great point to start with, Brian. It's the secondary problems that can come from anger, which I think are really important for us to acknowledge and obviously chat about today. There's a lot of shame, I think, what you mentioned there. The first word that comes to my mind is, I think there's a lot of shame that's often attached with anger, particularly if we don't understand the emotion of anger and the role that it plays in our personal, in our actual selves, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of shame that can be attached to it. And of course, shame then directly leads to self-criticism and, self-depletion sort of thing. So I think it's important for us to start with, for us to talk about anger. And as you say, it's a very human emotion. Everybody has experienced anger. Yeah, maybe to different levels, different levels of severity, and maybe it's more common for some people than others. But it is a human emotion, and it's important first of all to recognise that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with anger, if it's used in the right way, then it's absolutely fine. I think, like you've just said there, it can often be a secondary emotion. It can be an emotion that people use because that's the only emotion that they've ever been taught from a young age. I think anger, when you're very young, sort of 4, 5, 6, 7 type of thing. I think I remember seeing some research, and I think that's when people are the most, anger's the most common emotion at that age, because frustration, you're trying to learn things, you've not quite learned how to communicate, obviously, because you're still a child, so anger becomes a real way of trying to express yourself. And if that's not taught at that age, you don't always have to react angrily, then people can grow up thinking that anger is the way to express themselves, get things they want, be accepted, be loved even sometimes.
Yeah, maybe, and as I think you mentioned there, right, it can maybe be the most acceptable emotion as well, to the people close to them, whether it's friends or family or parents. And we'll come on to this later on in the episode, I'm sure, but it's a primitive emotion, anger as well, isn't it? It's designed to protect us and to keep us. It can feel like the safest emotion, and as you say, it doesn't surprise me at all that if there's research that suggests it's the most it's the go-to emotion for young children. But I guess as well, that's why I think it can be hopefully be. I'm sure we'll have a good conversation today. It can hopefully be helpful for us to chat about anger, because it's not just how we experience anger as the individual, but also how we understand anger, because it helps us not understand our own experience of it, but also when other people are angry. If you know somebody who's angry all the time, if we can make sense of anger as an emotion in and of itself, we can then hopefully have a better relationship with people who seem to be, seem to be angry quite often. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. So, how would you say you would understand anger as emotion then, do you think?
I think it's often an emotional hijacking. I remember hearing that term, that description once, and I think that's a great starting point with anger, is that it is a real... Anger can be often is an impulsive emotion, and as I think you touched on there, Brian, it can give us the sense of feeling safe. It's our survival emotion in many ways. It's the go-to emotion when we feel like we're under threat, and if we don't understand it, or if we don't respond to it in a way that is constructive for us, for ourselves, I think that's when it becomes a very, like, as I say, it's an emotional hijacking then. We see exactly what anger wants us to see and nothing else. So I would say that's the first thing for me with anger, is to recognise that if we don't understand it, and we are maybe haven't reflected on it, you know what I mean? If it's just, we see it as is here, we hear it quite often. And I'm sure you and I have said this as well, maybe in the past, is I'm an angry person. That's just the way I am. I'm angry.
Yeah.
And for me, I would say the real challenge there is that we're defining ourselves by a very specific emotion, and a powerful bloody emotion at that as well.
We're making that emotion who we are. And it's the same with, I think we, again, probably mentioned it on the previous podcast around anxiety. If people say, I'm just an anxious person, it's, you label that emotion to who you are, that becomes...
Yeah, you're defining your identity by it.
Your identity, yeah. And I think anger's exactly the same, yeah. I think by labelling yourself an angry person, then that's your go-to emotion, that's your first emotion, no matter what the situation is. And I think that's where it can become difficult a lot of the time for people, where understanding anger in the sense of, is it anger keeping you safe, and is anger the actual emotion that you're feeling, or is it something else? A good example of that, I suppose, is although actually before I give you the example, I think it's relevant for me to say that a lot of these examples that I've given previous podcasts are case studies that I've done, where the clients give me permission to use the examples of particular situations.
Of course, yeah.
Obviously, I'm not going to break confidentiality, but just if people are wondering, people have given me permission to use these examples when I've done case studies, when I've been studying and stuff. So I'm not breaking any confidentiality.
It's okay, just to, for anyone who may not be aware, case studies are like part of training as a therapist, aren't they?
Yeah.
And your client, as you say, your clients will have said, yeah, I'm giving you consent to, you anonymise their name, but you can write about my story and my journey in therapy and so on.
Yeah, so they've given permission for me to use some of these examples. But the example was, I was working with somebody who was involved in a gang, and they were about 13, 14 when they started in this gang. And they told me of a time they went to the nan's funeral, and I think they'd never been to a funeral before, but they went, and everybody that was there was sort of crying and upset, as you would be a normal human emotion. So they were able to allow themselves to be upset and cry, and which was perfectly normal, perfectly natural. And I think it was like 12 months later, somebody that they were involved in this gang with had been killed, and he went to the funeral, and he said he was going to the funeral, and in his mind he was going to go in and cry and everything, because that's how he thought funerals were, because of his previous experience. But when he got there, all the other people that were involved in this gang were all displaying anger and sort of wanting to go and avenge this person who'd been killed.
Aggression,
and aggression. So he, to fit in, to not be sort of feeling like the weak person in that group, became angry himself and just joined in. And then he gave me another example about a time when there was a situation where he was really scared, but because everybody else, and by the way, everybody else there was probably scared.
I was just thinking, I'm sure that he wasn't the only person experiencing sadness at the funeral or fear in what you're about to share, but it's the acceptable emotion, isn't it?
Acceptable emotion. So he became angry rather than becoming scared, because that felt like the safest emotion to display. It felt like he didn't want to look weak, he didn't want to be the odd one out. And then eventually he got away from the gang, which was really positive. But what he found was then later on in life, as he got a bit older, he found it really difficult to express the right emotions in the right situation. So other funerals he'd been to, he found it difficult to become upset because, of his experience. So he became angry instead. And he just found many situations throughout his life he would become really angry rather than expressing whatever that emotion was. And obviously we've done some work around it, and he was able to identify that and eventually sort of learn to understand the emotion he was feeling that was relevant to the situation, which is really good. But I just thought I'd use that example.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Oh no, thank you for sharing that as well. You've never shared that one with me before, and I think that's a great example of how anger can often, become incredibly destructive and become a mask for. When I think we mentioned earlier on in the episode, anger can often be what we'd call a secondary emotion. So I always think of that as like a mask. Okay, well, what's actually going on? And as we as you've just, that's a great demonstration, isn't it, of how anger is the mask for sadness at the funeral or for fear in a given situation, But you mentioned earlier on as well about, you said about that piece of research with children and anger being one of the most common, if not the most common emotion that children kind of perform and express. And I think so much of that comes back to, I would say some of the key points are, one, it's the acceptable emotion. It's the emotion that we become most familiar with, and maybe our environment responds to. It's almost predictable how people are going to respond when we perform anger. And the other thing I'd say as well is with that, Brian, and to me, the way I heard that example you just shared with us is, it was also a habit. That was the done thing. And anger is a habit as well. I think that's a really important thing to just to mention, is that with anger we don't. It's a little bit of a, if I can say, maybe a misconception, which I've certainly had when I was younger, that anger is like, don't bottle things up, express your emotions, get them out. And of course, we're not encouraging people to bottle up their emotions and don't talk to anybody. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, one of the key points of this podcast is quite the opposite: is to, engage with others and to access therapy or talk with people. But with anger, it's not about. We're not saying bottle it up, but when we act in a destructive anger, in a the go-to or almost a misunderstanding of anger, it doesn't release the anger. It doesn't get it out of our system. It feeds it. It trains it, and it rehearses it. And we will become angry. You may have, if you've ever spoken with somebody, or maybe we've ever experienced ourselves feeling angry, it does become a habit. We do it more often. We don't do it less often by allowing ourselves to perform anger in a destructive way. We actually start doing it more frequently. We become angry and aggressive more frequently. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a few reasons for that, isn't there? There's the chemical aspects of it, that sort of.
That's it. You train your brain, don't you? Neurologically, you train the neural pathways. Sorry to interrupt.
Not okay.
Say you train the neural pathways of your brain to respond with that emotion. It familiarises that emotion, and that's your go-to anytime you're uncertain of something or unsure how to respond or what's acceptable in a given group or a given environment. Your brain is used to anger. It as I say, it rehearses it, and that'll be your go-to response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And sometimes, again, especially when you're younger, if you get things as a result of being angry, then that can become very, suppose, what you've just said there, but it becomes an association as well, doesn't it? If you want something and you've had it through expressing anger before, then why wouldn't you? It's just obviously the problem with it is it's not helpful for you, and it's not helpful for people around you. It can actually be quite harmful, and it can lead into even more unhelpful behaviours and feelings and habits as well.
Definitely, yeah, of course, and I think when we reflect on ourselves, or when we sit in our own inner voice, if you like, and our thinking patterns, self-reflection, we probably, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't usually get what we actually want when we act out of destructive anger. We might tell ourselves, as you say, it's like, well, I'll do this, and then that'll get me this thing or this reward or this, some people will do as I want them to do, or they'll appease me and so on. But on reflection, quite often it's probably not what you want. Is maybe you want attention from that person. You want you to mean something to that person, just for example, rather than them just giving you what you're demanding from them. In a kind of state of anger.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I think it'd be good, just before we get kind of, continue with how unhelpful acting out of anger in a destructive way can be. When is anger helpful? Because we're saying it's a normal emotion. It's an emotion we all experience. How can it be helpful?
I think
What do we
sometimes it can help identify problems, or things that we're sort of hunting for or looking for. I think it can help motivate us. It can create change. It can help us achieve goals and sort of move on. It can help us stay safe. It can help us defend ourselves.
Definitely.
And certainly in sort of dangerous situations. It can give us a burst of energy as part of that, as part of our fight and flight, which I know we've spoke about before. So I think they're the main things where anger can be normal and even helpful to us. And again, like we spoke about with other on other episodes around, there's times when anxiety can be helpful to us, and it's a normal human emotion, and if it's used in the right context and in the right way, it's all about keeping us safe. And anger's the same. If it can be used in the right way, in the right context, then it's perfectly healthy, it's perfectly normal, and it's the right emotion to use at that particular time. So I think they're the times when anger can be useful and helpful. But obviously there's times when anger is a problem.
Oh yeah, and definitely I agree. It can be very motivational, and it can help us to push towards goals, whether it's everyday goals or what we might see as more kind of life goals, if you like. And it's that we were talking about the chemical balance, neurological chemistry just a moment ago, and anger can. It's that release of adrenaline, it's the release of cortisol from the brain into your nervous system. And I think when that's used constructively, when we're not purely acting on impulse, but we are using that energy, we are using that emotion in a way that works for us, and and not just for ourselves, but of course the goal or people around us, if you like. That's when it can be constructive. So I think the key point is how we use the emotion, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example that comes to mind, I don't know why it's just come to mind, but you often see it with football players. They make a mistake and you see them get up, and you can see the anger, the frustration, because they've made a mistake, and they go and get the ball, and then next minute score a goal. Yeah. I don't know why it comes to mind, but Manny for Liverpool, there's an example of it. I can't remember what game it was, but there's a game where he had the ball and he gave it away. It was like a bit of he made a bit of a mistake, and he got up and you could see he was angry, but he used that anger to go back, get the ball, and go back and score a goal.
Yeah,
I can't think of the game, but
no, I think sport's a great example of that. You mentioned football there. I remember, hopefully some of our listeners know Thierry Henry, famous Arsenal and French footballer, and he said he deliberately used to, if he was struggling in a game or he couldn't get into his rhythm, he would deliberately start an argument with an opposing player, because he would do that to get himself fired up. And he said he knew what he was doing, and he'd try and control the arguments. He'd try and control the kind of tit for tat on the pitch, and that he knew that would get his anger fired up, and then he would use that energy to kind of spare on his game, his performance. And again, yeah, sports I think is a great example of where anger can be, if it's used well, can be really motivational. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. So then I suppose on the opposite side of that is what is unhelpful angry behaviour then, do you think?
Unhelpful angry behaviours, well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the area of anger that we think of when we think of the emotion anger, or just the word anger, and the idea of like that often used term, the red mist. That comes back again, doesn't it, to what we spoke about a moment ago? Like anger is, a secondary emotion. It's masking something, and red mist is a bit like that, isn't it? It's masking a feeling that we've had, or some sort of, whether it's injustice or whether it's pain or sadness. The red mist is, I think, is a great example of where anger becomes the go-to, kind of the secondary.
That out of control feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think with unhelpful anger behaviours, well, I think it'd be good to actually explore what do we mean when we say that. And I think with first thing that comes to mind for me is kind of aggression and violence, outward aggression and violence.
So I think, I suppose maybe a way to put that into a context is the sort of three ways, isn't there, that you can describe like anger, as in
Unhelpful anger behaviours.
If you put them as like subtitles, outward aggression and violence is the first one, isn't it? Am I right?
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. And we'd say, I guess, passive aggressive would be another one, like non-violence, but nonetheless we're still expressing anger in a, shall we say, a destructive and unhelpful way.
But that would be, so I suppose, like outward aggression and violence, such as shouting, swearing, slamming doors, hitting or throwing things at someone, that type of physical violence, or even sort of verbal abuse and threatening towards others. It could be classed as that. And then I suppose the non-violent or passive aggression can be things like ignoring people or refusing to speak to them, refusing to do tasks, them type of things. And then the third one is inward aggression, isn't it, which is more about sort of such as telling yourself that you hate yourself or denying yourself your basic needs, and that can become, when it becomes really destructive to a person. I mean, that can then lead to things like self-harm, for example.
Well, depression as well.
And depression is a big one.
Depression, I think, there's a strong relationship between internalised anger and depression. And, just saying that, the first thought I had then was going back to one of the first things we mentioned in this episode is anger is a normal emotion. Mm-hmm. It's a human thing to feel angry, to feel that, the power of that. But if we feel shame and we feel that we should be, if that is internalised as something flawed about us, self-criticism, if that comes with an awful lot of negative self-judgment, when we feel angry or when we experience anger, when that's internalised, that can become a powerful monster that can just eat away at us. And of course, that's where depression really, unfortunately can really spread its wings and be very destructive, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with, again, with anger, I think especially if we're angry at other people, other people have maybe done things to upset us or hurt us or make us not feel good about ourselves, and we can become really angry about that. One quote that I love, and I've not used a quote so far, which is, I think, a record for
definitely a record, that, Brian.
I just wanted to get this one in, but I love the saying around sort of, holding on to anger is like holding a hot coal and expecting the other person to
throwing it at somebody.
Yeah, the only person you're really hurting is yourself. If you hold on to a hot coal, it's you that you're burning, it's you that you're hurting, rather than anybody else. And I think I always think about that when I think about anger, or if I feel anger myself and I'm thinking about, well, why am I angry? That saying always pops into my mind, and it just helps me. Definitely.
I think that's a great analogy for anger as well. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Because I love your quotes. I've told you this before.
Thank you. I'm going to do a book on them, I think.
Definitely. The Therapy Shed.
Book of quotes.
That'll do. See, very creative title we've just come up with there. But I think that's a great analogy for anger. Yeah. Holding on to a, piping hot piece of coal, and thinking it's going to hurt the other person or it's going to solve your problem in some way. That again comes back to not understanding anger, not allowing ourselves to process it, not allowing ourselves to experience it without without shame, without self-criticism, without feeling like I need to act in an angry way. And often I think that is often like maybe a substitute word, shall we say, for in a destructive way right now in this second. And I think I mentioned this earlier on in the episode. It's very trance state anger. We see and feel and give attention to a very, very limited amount of information in front of us, and it is only what we want to be angry about. And again, it comes back to anger feeds itself. It does become a habit, and it's that trance state we're very selective, incredibly selective about what we are going to give attention and meaning to, and it's usually purely the thing that we want to attack or we want to be aggressive towards. And that can, of course, as we said, going back to unhelpful anger behaviours, that can be ourselves as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why I think reflecting is really good, isn't it? I think reflecting on why did we feel angry, what was it that made us angry, because a lot of the time the thing that we have that maybe outburst for or become really angry at, often that's not even the reason why we become angry in the first place. It's a bit like, there's a few different examples, but it's a little bit like that pressure cooker, isn't it, around things are happening in our lives that are causing us to feel stressed, causing us to feel angry, causing us to feel frustrated, and then something really, trivial happens and we explode at this sort of fit of anger. And often when you look back, that thing didn't really make us angry. It was just a trigger for that anger to come out, where actually what's made us angry is the fact that, I don't know, our boss has been on our back around about deadlines, or we've just we're stressed over money worries, or we've not been getting on with family or friends, or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. And we feel like, I think what we might say in therapy is kind of a well-used turn of phrase is what need of yours isn't being met. What is it that we feel is key to ourselves, one of our values, or our primary needs is not being met at the moment, and maybe we're feeling like, well, I don't know how to do that, or I haven't got the time to do that at the moment. And unfortunately, anger fills up that space in us, that need. And again, as you say, we express that and we direct that and we maybe unleash that on something that really isn't the root of it, of our needs or our emotions at all.
And often that just becomes really unhelpful. Another good analogy around sort of anger and it being unhealthy is, have you heard the analogy about the two people at a bus stop and they're both going to a job interview?
No,
so,
go on.
So there's two people at a bus stop and they're going to a job interview, and the bus is late. So the first person sort of starts pacing up and down and going, I can't believe the bus is late, and I'm going to be late for my interview, and why is the bus late? I've been here for 15 minutes already, and pacing up and down, getting themselves really wound up, becoming really angry. And the other person goes, the bus is late, there's nothing I can do, and sits down on the chair and just sits there and thinks about how he's going to answer the questions, gives himself a bit more prep time to answer the questions for the interview. And then the bus comes, they both get on the bus. The first man on the bus why are you late? I've been waiting here, blah, 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 really angry, really frustrated. And the bus goes and the traffic's busy as well, so the first person, again, he's getting really more and more wound up. And the other person's just sitting there, going through his answers, what he's going to say, just keeping himself calm, relaxed. They both turn up at the interview. They both got there at the exact same time. They're both in the exact same situation. The only difference is the first person turns up really, really angry, not being able to concentrate and focus because he's too full with anger and frustration. And the second person's quite calm and relaxed and has had time to think about how he's going to answer the questions. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. And thanks again for sharing that. No, you haven't mentioned that one to me before. I will
have that one.
Keep that in my notebook. I will. I'm stealing all these, I'm telling you. But I think that's a great example of that's almost a great metaphor, if you like, of what we might think of as the emotional and the rational brain. So there's this area we have what's called dual processing systems in our mind, and the emotional brain, as it's often described, is where our kind of like survival mechanisms come from. People may have heard the fight or flight response, so that's rooted in the emotional brain. Anger is rooted in the emotional part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that we couldn't possibly live without. It keeps us safe, it keeps us alive, it's responsible for detecting threat, for perceiving our, as I say, our safety and our survival.
Very instinctive.
It's very instinctive, yeah. It's very impulsive in many ways, yeah. And they can all be, for reasons that we've mentioned in this episode, brilliant, really useful for us. But I think we've mentioned in previous podcasts as well, the rational brain. The other thing I would just say before we get onto the rational brain about the emotional brain is it's the most powerful area of the brain. It's the strongest area of the brain. It's the quickest area of the brain. And as we're saying, anger is rooted in this area of the brain. This is where it's kept, shall we say? And this area of the brain is far more powerful than the rational brain. It's far quicker.
Far more older as well, isn't it?
It's older, yeah. And it's the most primitive area of the brain, isn't it?
That's what I mean.
So it's like the most. It's like there's he's a sports psychologist, but I think he's a psychologist of all sorts now. He's kind of so well qualified. A guy called Steve Peters.
Oh, yeah.
He's got book. Have you heard of him? Yeah, and he's got books and audio books and stuff. I definitely recommend people checking him out. We're not getting sponsored by Steve Peters, by the way. He's just come to me, and he calls this area of the brain your chimp. He says that's the chimp. That's the most the most primitive area of the human brain. So the emotional area of the brain, and it is much quicker, and anger, again, is much quicker than the speed of thought. Now, when we think of thought, it's the rational area of the brain. So this area of the brain is more responsible for, like, creativity, language, emotional regulation, allowing multiple perspectives, trying to see if there's more detail, more information that we can take in before we respond or before we make sense. So it's the thinking area of the brain, really, in many ways.
The intelligent part of the brain.
Basically, yeah, exactly. And I think that's going back to your the bus stop example you've just shared there, Brian. That's all I could think of. Is a great kind of almost two people who are one's representing the emotional area of the brain, where they're just feeding the anger and they're just allowing the emotional, the chimp, if you like, to just run riot. And the other person is like, of course I'm frustrated. Of course I'd rather the bus was on time. But what can I do about it? Well, not very much right now. And the overall point of today, if you like, or the overall goal of this is for me to try and, do a good, perform well in this job interview. So the thinking area of the brain is very much in charge. That's the area of the brain that's been allowed to. He's turned the volume up there for the emotion, for the thinking brain. The rational mind in his overall brain, and I think that's a great example of the difference in outcome when we don't allow. I mean, this is I would say probably the most common technique, shall we say, for anger management that I'm sure everybody has heard of is count to 10. Just count to 10, and let your anger kind of reduce. And that's great, and I think that's it really. But I think it might be an interesting thing for you and I to just have a chat now for a minute about, well, what is the point of that? Why do we get told to count to 10? What's going on for us in our brain when we're counting to 10?
Well, I think you're saying about the example I gave, the two people, the two men. What one was using the primitive brain, one was using the intelligent brain, and I think the idea of counting to 10 is to help switch from the primitive brain to the intelligent brain. It just gives yourself a second to just stop and to think, which hopefully then allows you to then just get them two parts of the brain talking to each other a little bit, because often that's the gap that's missing. The intelligent part of the brain on its own sometimes is not helpful. The primitive side of the brain on its own is not always helpful either. Most of the time, it's about the two of them communicating with each other.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think that's where counting to 10 as a very basic strategy And just while it's on my mind, if anybody is listening, that book that we spoke about, it's the Chimps Paradox, isn't it?
That's it, Steve Peters.
Yeah.
That's his main book, I think,
Yeah,
isn't it? The Chimp Paradox. Yeah, it's a great.
What we're talking about, but obviously in a lot more detail.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with that, the point you make there about trying to get the, as we're saying, like the chimp brain, the emotional brain, and the rational, intelligent brain, to try and work together, to become friends, to work as a team. That's a great point about that kind of directly relates to not denying your anger, not shaming yourself if you feel angry, not giving yourself a hard time, or refusing to recognise your anger, because that's when you're, if you like to apply that to those two brains, if you like, in our overall mind, that's almost like the thinking, intelligent brain trying to fight or trying to suppress the emotional brain. It doesn't work. The emotional brain's too powerful. It's too intelligent. It's too powerful, and it's much quicker than the rational brain. So, of course, it's again, to relate that to anger. It's recognise your anger. Try and just sit with it for a minute, and the key point is then how we respond to it, not denying it and not giving ourselves a really hard time, or devaluing ourselves because we feel angry or because we experience anger. It's to then try and the key point is how we then respond to it. That's the vital point, I think.
And I think the key to that is, it's about that self-compassion, isn't it? It's about being kind to yourself. It's about giving yourself that reassurance. So, when you're feeling angry, it's about saying it's okay to be angry and not, because what often happens is people get angry about being angry, and then beat themselves up, and like we said about that.
And it feeds it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but it just comes back to that point of just feeds the anger. It rehearses anger, so you will become more angry if you're angry about being angry.
But if you can be more passionate towards yourself about it, and almost have that, give the anger that reassurance of like, look, we're safe, we're okay. I don't need to be angry right now, for example. So again, just using the example of the two people at the bus stop, the second person, that anger would have been there, that frustration of the bus not coming would have been there, but he was maybe able to use the front part of his brain, the intelligent part of his brain, to say, look, I know I'm frustrated, I know you're angry, but
makes sense that we're angry right now.
But we're safe, so we don't need to be angry right now because I'm okay, I'm safe. What I do need to do is challenge this sort of emotion into thinking about what I'm going to do in this job interview, for example.
That's it, and you can use that energy. I think certainly if you practice your response to anger and how to make it work for you, you can then rehearse. The mind is incredibly plastic, but it does like routine as well. So it's about challenging maybe those, our behavioural and thinking routines, habits, and then once we tweak them into a way that works better for us, you might surprise yourself how quickly you can actually start responding to anger in this example far more kind of constructively for yourself. It can become a useful motivation, as in that example where those two guys are going for a job interview. The guy who actually managed and processed his anger in a more constructive way, it was likely that he actually had far more to offer in the interview. He was sharper, he was more kind of engaging in a constructive way than the guy who sounds like was still full of rage when he was sitting in the interview. Do you know what I mean?
Well, like we said before, the example of like that red mist and things like that, where that's how he would have been going into the interview, where the other person would have been going into just a lot more calm and relaxed. I think, obviously in this episode we've scratched the surface, shall we say, on anger, to give a bit of an overview. I think, I know one of the episodes we've got lines up is to have a guest come on who specialises in anger. They work specifically with working with
Work
anger.
more closely with
Yeah.
anger, don't they? Yeah, definitely.
And we can get a bit more, because there's lots of sort of facets to it, isn't there? As in, you know, a lot of people, there's the whole mask situation of people use anger as a mask, and it's about learning to take that mask off and understand yourself and understand all the emotions rather than just using anger, which again, you know, that in itself is an hour's podcast, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
And it'd
yeah.
be great, obviously, to have that conversation with someone who's a little bit more specialised than yourself and I.
Mhm.
So that will, and again, if anybody's got any questions or suggestions that they'd like us to they'd like us to explore when we have an episode on anger with a guest, then please do drop us a line on Instagram, the Therapy Shed Podcast, or of course drop us an email, therapyshedpodcast@gmail.com.
I just wondered if we've got time to just maybe go over a few like strategies or coping mechanisms to
We
deal
have,
and
for you, Brian,
manage.
I've got all the time in the world.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be a great idea. Just some suggestions and maybe, did you say some techniques maybe
Yeah.
we could share?
You could mention,
Yeah. What would you like to start with?
I think one that I like to use quite a lot, because it's very common, is I really like using reframing a lot.
Cognitive reframing.
Cognitive reframing.
Yeah.
And a really good example that a lot of people can relate to is with driving. So like road rage, shall we say, where you're driving down and you might be having a nice relaxing drive, or you maybe you're in a rush to get somewhere, you might be trying to get to work yourself and, you know, time's against you a little bit, and then somebody in another car does something, cuts you up. What we tend to do is we tend to take it very personally. They done that to me. They done that because it was me, and we attach it to ourselves, as in we take it personally. So then what happens is we feel that's where the anger can come up then, and that's where the road rage, and you know, we start screaming and shouting and swearing at the person, and you know, beeping the horn, or you know, all them type of things. Sometimes it can get a lot more serious than that. You know, people have died, haven't they, as a result of road rage, which, you know,
I think that's a great example
is
of
crazy. But you know, if we think like general road rage, where you just get really angry and you're swearing and beeping your horn, or, you know, all those types of things, sometimes the person who's done, you know, the cutting up is not even aware that you're raging as much as you are, and they might just turn off the next turn and you carry on, and all that happens is you're just left with that frustration and anger. So wherever you get to, you end up going in there and feeling angry. If you were calm and relaxed before that happened, all of a sudden you know, angry, you're really frustrated. Or if you're going into work angry before you even started your day. So with cognitive reframing, it's about changing that emotion. It's about changing the story you're telling yourself in your head of, can't believe that person just cut me off, you know, what are they doing, type of thing. So a good way to do it is depending on what your go-to emotion. So for example, if you sort of find things quite funny, if you're able to you know make jokes of things, make things quite funny, or if you're able to be, you know, if you're really an empathic person. So it's about changing that story in your own mind. So if that person cut you up, reframing it would be, for example, it could be, oh, I bet they've got a bit of an upset stomach and they've got diarrhea, and if they don't make it home, they're going to have a bit of an accident, and you might find that quite funny. So, you know, the emotion that you're left with is laughter. So you sort of laugh to yourself, and you know, which is obviously better than being angry. If you're more empathic, it must be, it could be, they must be on the way to see a sick relative, or they're late for a job interview, or you know, something like that. So then you feel sorry for them then, rather than they've cut me up because you know they're a boy racer, and you know, then you become the emotion that you're left with is anger. So it's all about what emotion that you're going to leave yourself with. So with cognitive reframing, I think that's a really good one to use, and that for me, road rage is a good one to practice it on, certainly.
Definitely, yeah, and I completely agree. Yeah, cognitive reframing, and that's something if you accessed therapy, you could work on that with your therapist as well, and really, again, coming back to developing maybe more constructive thinking habits for yourself. That's something that cognitive reframing would be a good one for you to work on in the therapy room.
And obviously it's a little bit more in depth than that example I've gave, but that's just as an example. That's just as an example of, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of assumptions that we make, to use that, you know, just to go back to that example for a second. There's a lot of assumptions we make immediately, as you say. We personalise it. That person's cut me up. They did it intentionally. They did it as a kind of almost like a contest or some sort of confrontational way. We make a lot of assumptions initially, because I think sometimes with cognitive reframing, as the you know, the person who's trying to go through that process, shall we say, as the client, if it was in therapy, sometimes it can be oh, well, that just sounds like you're just going to lie to yourself. It's like, well, you're not lying to yourself. What you're doing is looking at what are the assumptions you've made in order to get very quickly to anger. That person's just done this to me. I now need to, you know, shout and swear and gesture to them and whatnot. Or as you say, maybe violence and aggression can be a go-to. There's a lot of assumptions that you've made in order to get to that stage, even though it's happened in milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, cognitive reframing is just checking in with your assumptions and going, well, what if that was the thing? And it's so interesting when you do just actually explore that for a little bit, how your thinking can change, your emotions can change, and of course the way you respond to it can then change as well.
And also something that we've touched on in that situation, as in, you know, being in a car and road rage, the first emotion might not be anger, it might be fear. You know, if someone's done something that's quite dangerous and, you know, you felt fear because potentially it could cause an accident, or you know, you've had to instinctively, you might have had to slam on, or you might have had to you know, do something to keep yourself safe. So your initial feeling is not anger, it could be fear.
Yeah. Or a sign of almost like a belief that means I'm weak. That person's cut me up. They've done it to me. Therefore, I'm weak. You know, it's when we do that reflection, it can be interesting, the assumptions that we make, you know, rooted in our emotions and also about ourselves. That person's done that to me. Out of everyone in this traffic jam, they saw me as the weak planet. It's like probably not the case, but these are all the very kind of super fast assumptions and the way we can internalize things very, very quickly. And as you say, anger becomes the go-to, the safe emotion that we respond with. So yeah, I think cognitive reframing is a great example of something that people could try. You know, just kind of looking at maybe if we told ourselves a slightly different story about how and why something's just happened, does that help us to respond more constructively to anger? I suppose a very common one as well in terms of techniques would be exercise. Now, of course, it's, you know, exercise means different things to each of us, but with that, we mentioned earlier on about the build-up of adrenaline, a build-up of different chemicals in the brain being released into the system. Exercise can be a great way of, to use a well-worn phrase, blowing off some steam, of just allowing that energy to be used constructively. You know, it's good for us and it's constructive for our relationships as well, you know, or it's not destructive for our relationships, which anger can often be if it's not used.
And also a big one with the exercises, it's a really good way of releasing stress, and obviously stress can often be the build up to anger.
Of course.
So by, you know, exercising, and you're able to release a lot of the stress, which again, you know, sort of chemical wise, we're talking about cortisol and adrenaline.
Yeah, exactly, and release, getting those endorphins released from the brain into the system is crucial as well. So yeah, exercise is definitely something, and it means different things to different people, you know. So if exercise for you is going for a walk around the block, or of course cycling, or if it's something a bit more intense,
in the gym
or long distance, or you know, whatever it may be, that's your thing. We definitely, you know, there's, of course, that's a good way of releasing that tension and that frustration that can be attached to anger. Just one more I'd like to share before we come towards the end of the episode is maybe looking, and we've kind of explored this, I think, in our conversation today, is but looking at what's the root of your anger. You mentioned this earlier on, didn't you, Brian? But that sense of, are you angry with that thing or that particular person, Or was that you've mentioned a few times, the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back? Is that the easy thing to express your anger on?
Or the safest.
Or the safest, of course, yeah. That's probably more relevant, actually. Or is that the safest thing for you to unleash your anger on? So exploring the root, and again, it's been a key theme, I feel, in this conversation today, is anger is often a secondary emotion. It is very often a mask. It is that red mist. If we feel some of the examples you shared, sadness or fear, anger is a very is a go-to default kind of emotion that can mask those vulnerabilities, if you like, those other emotions of fear and sadness and so on. So what is the root of your anger? I think can be a good one to use as just a reflection in yourself. And again, it's important to try and do that when you're feeling in a little bit more of a safe and hopefully relaxed environment as well, because the brain is, we talk about the rational and the emotional brain. The rational brain is more likely to be active when you actually are in a more relaxed and safe place. But that can be a good time to check in with, what am I actually angry about? Because I feel like I'm getting angry quite often lately with things that didn't mean much to me, maybe until they happened, or So actually checking in with what the root of our anger is can be a good technique as well.
Definitely, and again, as a strategy, is what you're saying there is around. It's about talking to people, isn't it? And if talking to family, friends, as we spoke about, can be really helpful. But sometimes, if you feel like you need that extra bit, then that's when therapy starts coming into consideration, which can be really helpful. Being able to sit in a room and not be judged at the fact that you might get angry, or you're feeling really angry, but not understanding it. So
certainly, yeah, and given therapy can be a great environment as well for giving yourself permission to not judge yourself, to acknowledge and be more aware of your anger, accept your anger without judgment. I think therapy can be a great, as we've said before, a confidential space to give yourself permission to do that.
And learn how to give yourself that compassion.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So yeah, talking to people, as we always say, talking helps. Well, I think we've had a good conversation there about all things looking back at anger.
Yeah.
As we said, we will have a future episode which goes a little bit more in depth, maybe offers more specific examples and explores, gets in a little bit deeper into certain areas of anger, with a guest which works more closely with anger with clients and so on. But yeah, of course, as I keep saying, any feedback, please let us know and get in touch. But what's our next episode?
Well, I think the next episode is our final episode of this series, isn't it? So I think we're going to do a bit of a look back and a reflection on how they've gone so far, and how that can maybe relate to therapy as well.
Yes. Yeah. Reflection and endings. I am as well, yeah. Reflection and endings.
So yeah, I suppose the theme or the title of the next episode will be around sort of endings.
Yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to that one myself. Well,
and the journey so far.
Absolutely, yeah. And we'll kind of reflect on, obviously, we touched on this at the beginning of the episode, but obviously, of course, our experience of doing these podcasts, this is new for us. We're learning all the time, of course, and the feedback and people's comments always helps with that, and helps us to shape our plans for future episodes and topics we're going to delve into as well. So please do get in touch on Therapy Shed Podcast on Instagram, or of course on email, therapyshedpodcast@gmail.com.
Yep.
And I look forward to catching up next time.
Definitely. I think that's a wrap.
I enjoyed that, yeah. I'm feeling very, very processed of all my frustration and anger now. It was very relaxing.